Congressman Beyer, you sit down, make yourself comfortable. And it is a fireside chat.
I was looking
I don't
for the
know where
fireplace.
I'm not sure where the flames will be, but I can think of a few executive orders I'd like to use as kindling. Just a thought. We can start with that and see where it goes from there. We are here to talk about cancer and ultimately water and drinking water eventually. But I have to acknowledge what you've been up to over the past few days, having seen your experience at Dulles Airport, part of your district or on the edge of your district at least?
Just outside.
Just outside the district. He's from the 8th District across the river in Virginia. And please give him a round of applause. He was out there, I don't know if you followed it, but he was giving faces to what are called bad characters, or whatever the term has been offered up from the White House. And there's a great article he wrote in Politico, which I really commend to you. You should read it, on his experiences on the individuals who were caught up in this horrible, crazy executive order, which is so un-American. Just a few words, Congressman Beyer, on what you saw there, just so people could understand.
You know, I went out there with sort of low expectations. Didn't think there'd be many people there. There was like 200 folks when I first showed up. And many of them, 25, 30, 40, were attorneys. And they would have the name, they'd say, Miles, immigration attorney on it. And they kept dragging, once they figured out that I was a member of Congress and theoretically of mild importance, they kept dragging me from family to family to family to hear their stories. And I confess, after 4.5 hours, I was emotionally exhausted, not on my own behalf, but both of the frustration that you couldn't do anything about many of these stories. The very first one was they had big pictures of a 35-year-old Sudanese-born man who's now an American green card holder who was in intensive care in one of the D.C. hospitals. And his mother, who is a Sudanese national, had received the visa, probably a hardship visa, from our embassy to come visit him, and they wouldn't let her get on the airplane in Dubai to come see. And so she was afraid he was going to die without her ever seeing him again, and nothing I could do. Another young man who was a green card holder, Iraqi, and he'd worked for the U.S. Army for years and years as a translator and interpreter, and his son was born here, he was 2 years old, and his wife, again, Iraqi citizen, green card holder, had gone home to visit her mother, who was dying of cancer. And he literally just sobbed on my shoulder for 5 minutes because he was afraid he'd never see his wife or his son again. And that if he went back to get his son, that he wouldn't be allowed back in. And I assured him that that was Saturday's interpretation. The green card holders were included, and Sunday's interpretation was they weren't. And it's changed a couple more times through the course of the week. But this went on, story after story after story. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. Since then, the stories are coming in the thousands. I saw Governor McAuliffe last night who said there are more than 100 students just at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond that are here on student visas that either, if they leave, they'll never be able to come back, or if they went home, they can't come back right now. So the impact it's going to have on our colleges and universities, but also on the young men and women who could be the future of our country in their creativity. Great little statistic. U.S. won 6 Nobel Prizes this last year. All 6 were people born overseas.
Yeah, we are a nation of immigrants, and I guess that's getting lost in the shuffle. Anyway, we're here to talk about less cancer, but I did want to acknowledge that, and we do appreciate your good work on this front. And it's interesting. Executive orders, they give and they take away. The one that we might want to transition to here now is something called the Stream Protection Rule, which was signed by President Obama in December. The Stream Protection Rule is all about mountaintop coal mining, the decapitation of mountains in West Virginia. I'm a pilot, and I have a small airplane, and a year or so ago I flew across diagonally West Virginia at about 3,000 feet. This is something that, I'm pretty privileged to be able to do that, and not many people get to see the ground in that kind of proximity. It's not like flying in an airliner. I was horrified at how we have raped that poor state to provide coal for our power plants when it really is not necessary. It's just there are 500 mountaintops that have been decapitated in West Virginia, and about 2,000 miles of streams beneath them that have been ruined by the material that is just dumped there. So this is something that cries out for regulation, of course. At the end of the Obama administration, the Stream Protection Act came into existence. Tell us a little bit about what it is intended to do, first of all.
Well, let me just, by preface for just a paragraph, there's a great piece in the New York Times maybe 6 weeks ago about the dramatic reduction in the incidence of many different cancers. Not just lung cancer because people aren't smoking, but colon cancer and pancreatic cancer, et cetera, et cetera. And the science writers for the New York Times said, the scientists and the epidemiologists can't clearly explain why this is happening, except that since the early 1960s, with the beginning of Rachel Carson's book, we have, and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the creation of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, we have cleaned up the environment dramatically with a huge impact on our health. And one of the last places where we really have not made a dent is with mountaintop mine removal and the surfacing. Some of you have probably read How Green Was My Valley or saw the movie, which is all about coal mining in the UK, in England. And the tragedy of that was the fact that anytime you mine coal, there's some coal and there's a lot of slag. And what do you do with the stuff that has no commercial value? And the answer, the easiest thing to do is dump it in the streams. And so we see, as Miles said, the 2,000 miles of streams. It's not just that the land looks great, it's that the health consequences for the people that live there are so great. Again, New York Times a couple of years ago had an article on I think it was the 21 counties in America where the death rate was going up rather than going down. 7 of them were in the coal fields of Southwest Virginia. So if you look down there, and I was lieutenant governor for 8 years and ran for governor, so I spent 9.5 years traveling the state and made 100 trips to Southwest Virginia. A lot of that was based on the old, somebody asked Napoleon's mother which of her 6 children was her favorite child, and she said, whichever one needs me the most. And I always felt that the place that needed me the most was Southwest Virginia and the coal fields, which is why I went there so often. So there was a vigorous debate on the House floor yesterday afternoon with those of us arguing to protect the stream protection rule. It was 7 years being developed by the Office of Surface Mining. And those who were vigorously fighting it, who tended to be representatives from the coal fields, West Virginia, Kentucky, Southwest Virginia. And it was an interesting debate because they were looking at it in terms of jobs and we were looking at it in terms of health, which is a meaningful debate. But that's where we are. In fact, Representative McKinley, who's a good guy, a Republican from West Virginia, said, we need to overturn the stream protection rule for the good of the people of West Virginia and for all Americans. And I hope I wasn't being hostile. I said, I'd like to re-quote you. We need to keep the stream protection rule for the good of people of West Virginia and for all Americans.
Indeed. The stream protection rule, what specifically would it have done if it had been enacted?
Well, the biggest single thing is it wouldn't allow them to dump the slag into the streams. That basically you had to have buffers, and I don't remember the number of feet buffers on either side, but it would have basically protected the water supply, which is incredibly important. There's a separate issue, not with stream protection rule, about with fracking and the huge discovery of shale natural gas, and which has been a boon for our energy prices and given us some energy independence. But one of the most problematic issues there is what are the dangers to our water supply? Both the water that's used to frack the rock underneath and the danger of that water polluting other artesian wells in the water streams underneath. So all this goes together, this natural tension between how do we get the energy we need to make the country grow and thrive, and at the same time, do the best we can to protect our health.
So the vote was 228 to 194 in the House. Was it yesterday or the day before?
It was yesterday.
Yesterday to, and this is a little obscure piece of legislation that makes this possible, the Congressional Review Act, which goes back to the Newt Gingrich, 1996 Congress, I guess. Tell us what the Congressional Review Act is all about. And Are you expecting some other environmental shoes to drop in this context based on some of the orders that came out of the latter days of the Obama administration?
Yes, absolutely. So the Congressional Review Act was intended essentially to stop midnight regulation. They didn't want a president in the last couple of weeks of his administration, when he had no political consequence because he was about to go off and play golf in Hawaii, to drop regulations in that would have a really huge impact. I think the formal regulation Kate made is 100 working days.
60
So
working
60
days.
okay.
60 working days, which I guess
Yeah.
5 days a week.
Well,
How many
it's not
days a
your
week do you
working
guys really
days.
work?
It's,
You work what?
2.5.
2.5 days a week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, we'll be
So it's
more
like-
this year. Now
So it's
that
like 6
units
months.
are in
It's
control.
about 6 months.
Yeah, I think it
back,
went
right?
back
Yeah.
to August.
In June. I believe
so-
it goes back. So basically, everything Obama signed from June on is susceptible to this Congressional Review Act. Now, I should tell you, this has not been tested by the courts. It doesn't feel very constitutional. But go ahead and explain how this
they haven't
works.
been tested by the courts, and I can promise you there are a lot of people eager to test a lot of things right now. But one of the other interesting problematic pieces of it is the legislation. If you use the Congressional Review Act to overturn the stream protection rule, it also says that you can't do any further regulation on stream protection. So it not only affects this, but it literally ties the regulators' hands for literally years and years to come. This goes part and parcel with a political philosophy that thinks that regulation should not be done by the executive branch, but that they should be done one at a time by Congress, which would make sense if you thought Congress really moved quickly or effectively. And that just means basically the interpretation is virtually nothing would be regulated.
Well, it seems we're seeing the other edge of the sword right now with executive orders, aren't we? So that poison pill portion of this, that's the part that seems that it might not stand the test of the courts. What do you think?
I hope so, because it's in the Virginia legislature, we had the back of the envelope saying that no one legislature could commit a future legislature to any given type process. And that, I guess, is the concern here, too. Why should this Congress be able to lock out future administrations from doing anything good? And by the way, Miles, another one that's very much at risk, because we had a huge debate over the appropriate level for the ozone standard. And George W. Bush had wanted to take it to 65 parts per billion and had backed off because of industry. Barack Obama, early in his administration, wanted to take it to 65 and had backed off. The scientists who testified before the Science Committee said 60 is what you need to preserve life and keep down the many negative, both life-threatening and just uncomfortable asthma attacks and the like. So we did, the regulation of the EPA said was 65, and that's going to be very much at risk with the CRA, the Congressional Review Act.
All right, so we'll be watching and keep fighting the good fight. Please, Representative Don Beyer, give him a round of applause.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Miles, good to see you.